My name is Stephen Frailey. I am the editor of Dear Dave magazine. That seems so ridiculous saying that when I know all of you so well, or most of you. In this sort of situation, I always like to begin with a gesture of gratitude. First of all, thanking all of you for being here on such a beautiful day when you could be doing so many other things and celebrating what seems to be the first day of summer. But I also just wanted to thank Michael Foley of the Foley Gallery for being so generous. And yeah, bravo. Usually you have to work so hard to get something like this done and persuade people, and Michael was just his idea. He came to us with the possibility of doing an exhibition over a couple of days, and so I want to thank him for his generosity and for his great ideas. I also want to thank my dear friend Alice Durant for coming up from Baltimore to do this, and also being a sort of guiding light to the magazine as the editor at large, and contributing so much to our efforts and to our project. And then lastly, I also want to thank Maria Dubon, who is the managing editor of the magazine, and who literally, none of this would happen without her efforts. She's the one who does all the heavy labor, both in terms of putting the magazine out every issue and putting the show together. She's a terrific person. Okay. Okay.
Oh, is it my turn, I guess?
Is everyone in the right place? Okay.
Hi, I'm Mark, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for coming, as Stephen said. And I'm also really happy to be part of Dear Dave. I'm really happy to be your friend.
This is like a bar mitzvah.
Yeah. I met Stephen in 1999 when he was the chair of the Barren MFA photo program, and he hired me without even meeting me, without having met me, just through a phone interview.
Yeah.
But maybe Tina put in a good word for me, perhaps, you know.
Which I would have disregarded, but.
But anyway, so I learned a lot working with you at Bard, and when you started Dear Dave, I just thought it was a fantastic idea because of knowing a little bit about your philosophy about photography, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's just remarkable accomplishment, you know, for the last, has it been 8 years almost? 8 years?
It's been 2007.
Yeah, so that's 8 years.
Yeah,
so I think we should just begin. Thanks for being here. So I have a series of questions, which you know, and I'm going to ask them.
And will we have time to answer some questions from the audience if there are any?
I think so. I think you should just shout them out at any time, but if you don't want to wait till the end, that's fine as well.
Yeah, shout them out.
All right, so, you know, we just answered part of this question, but when did you start Dear Dave, and why did you start Dear Dave in the first place?
As we just mentioned, the magazine was started in 2007. We publish 3 times a year. So yes, this is our 19th issue. I've just begun to work on number 20. There's so many different reasons to have started it. One answer is, well, why not? But at the time, the 2 major magazines that covered photography, I think covered different aspects of the photo community, and I thought that that they left certain constituencies and certain trains of thought and certain practices out. I think, as long as you're on the topic, I think, you know, the 2 magazines at the time were Blind Spot and Aperture, and Blind Spot takes, you know, a fairly conceptual, theoretical approach to the medium, and at the time Aperture, I felt, was concentrating more on the history of the medium and had a much more conservative approach. Aperture, under the direction of Michael Famighetti, has changed enormously, and I think it's a very spirited and progressive and unpredictable entity now. So that's a already long-winded answer to your question, but I thought that there was a need to showcase a photographic community that was very plural and gives some room for a lot of different voices. To show work which was completely unknown and from some very young photographers that I didn't feel had the space to show their work, and also to possibly discover some work which had not been widely seen.
Yeah. So why a print publication? I mean, this is a time when a lot of people have gone onto digital online publications because of, you know, accessibility, money, et cetera. Why is print important?
Hopefully print has a certain longevity that, that digital will not. I'm not sure about that, but I think there's also the desire to create a beautiful object, to create something which has physical characteristics, something that hopefully people will save and put on their shelf and refer to. Maybe I'm being a little sentimental or nostalgic, but so I think that it's permanence. And I also think, you know, if you look at the magazine, it appears, when you look at information online, it appears as oftentimes just another part of visual static, and I wanted to separate from all of that information.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. You're welcome.
I don't really agree with you, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, we'll just
Well, let's talk about that. So you think the magazine is unnecessary?
That's not the part I.
Yes.
No, I think that obviously having, you know, being a founder of an online publication, that
Yes.
they can have they can stand out from the rest to some extent. But I agree with you that having the object is really important. You know, that's sort of part of the sort of material culture
Yeah.
of life is very different from the sort of visual online culture, and has a certain kind of physical presence that I think really grounds one in the experience of it.
I would like to think also that one immerses himself in printed matter in the way that they don't online. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I would just like to have a shout out to St. Lucie, which
That's why I said that. Yeah.
which amongst all the visual clutter and the information clutter is one of the most significant online photography.
Thank you, Steve. I was waiting when you were going to say that.
I'll say it again. I'll say it again in a bit.
So you often speak of the plurality, I think you sort of addressed this, but the plurality of photography, photographic practice. Mm-hmm. And Dear Dave seems to be a testament to that. And I know you sort of addressed that a little bit, but is there anything else you want to say about that?
Well, it's something that's always interested me, not only as a magazine editor now, but also as an educator. I think throughout its history, photography as a genre, I guess many mediums do this, but photography segregates itself among different genres and different motivations and different purposes. And on one hand, that seems really logical that it would do so, but I'm also interested in the way that it overlaps. And as an educator, encouraging an equal investigation of all different kinds of photography. And I think in terms of the way that print publications have operated in relation to photography, you know, again, it's a sort of conventional, here are the fine art publications, here are the commercial publications. And I think one of the most gratifying and important aspects of photographic practice now is that they overlap.
Yeah. I want to just say, Stephen, I know some of you may not be aware of this, is a really good artist as well. He's made some really, really fascinating images over the years. And
thank you, Mark.
You're welcome.
You might be one of the few people that actually that think that.
Well, I'm raising it right now because it reminds me, what you said reminds me of your work in the sense that your work as a photographer operated in the fine art realm, it operated in print, and also in the editorial realm. Mm-hmm. So Stephen often worked in this sort of studio fashion in which he assembled images for the camera, sort of montages, collages, you know, juxtaposing variety of sort of disparate, you know, gestures or rhetoric, visual flotsam. Really funny, sort of very nuanced, and you know, sort of sly in a way. And I think that's also, I think that's in some ways part of the aesthetic of Dear Dave, but we can talk about that later. Mm-hmm. But that sort of approach to photography as a maker, did that sort of influence you as an editor, in a sense?
I haven't really thought much about that, but it's possible that it has, because in my own practice, I rely upon lots of different kinds of information in order to construct an image that I'm interested in, and I don't think, I mean, it's non-hierarchical. It's any place that I can get, you know, whether it's from high culture or popular culture. Right. So perhaps you're right. I mean, I'm in an interesting position as an artist because I work in seclusion, and it's an interesting way to make images without them being seen. And then at the same time, I have this vehicle that I promote a lot of different kinds of work.
Right.
So I appreciate that dichotomy.
Well, again, I'm sort of off script here, but
That wasn't our deal.
but anyway, so I mean, everyone has an agenda, of course, right? Could be a political agenda, or aesthetic agenda, theoretical agenda, and being in academia myself, I sort of live amongst those agendas, shall we say. But again, one of the things I admired you as a teacher and as a maker and now as an editor is the fact that your agenda appears to be a kind of like broad embrace of you're looking for quality, of course, and something that sort of interests you and moves you and delights you on some level, but it's not about like, oh, this is the proper way to make an image, or this is what's going on now in terms of sort of an approach or a sort of political position. It's not that at all.
Well, again, going back to one of the aspirations is to with every issue to present a number of different kinds of photography, which most often are seen as at least competing with one another, or at least being part of separate discourses, separate communities. And I like the idea of presenting everything at once and giving it equal weight and equal emphasis. Yeah. I'm not sure it's as broad a gesture as possible. I mean, I think one could argue, looking at all the work in this room, that it shares, despite its genre motivation, it shares certain characteristics,
Okay.
or at least a sensibility.
Maybe.
One could argue.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Okay.
So in the very, very first issue of Dear Dave, next to Dear Dave, wait, what am I trying to say? In the very first issue, next to the Dear Dave letter, you have a column of odd names and phrases such as Art Linklater, refuse, seesaw, hedge, two penguins.
Two penguins, yeah.
North of Texas, same vague ambition, which might be my
that's an acronym
favorite.
for School of Visual Arts, SVA. I thought same, some or same?
Same.
Same vague ambition, right. Yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Anyway, another phrase is Roger Thornhill, who I think is the Cary Grant character in North by Northwest.
Well, Roger Thornhill is also listed on the masthead, and no one has ever asked me about this. If you look on the masthead, there's an advisory committee of some well-known...
And they're fictional?
No. Philip Gefter indeed exists, as does Jessica Craig Martin. At least I think they do. But also listed is Roger Thornhill, and no one has ever said, who the fuck is Roger Thornhill? But, oh, sorry, Aiden. Roger Thornhill is the character in North by Northwest.
Yes.
Played by Cary Grant. And there's a terrific line terrific scene, may I tell this story?
Yes, I want you to. Yeah.
That he and Eva Marie Saint are sitting on the train. He lights her cigarette. There's a matchbook that says ROT, his initials. And Eva Marie Saint says, what does the O stand for? And he says, nothing. Which I think is the perfect, philosophical, and anyway.
Okay.
The list of names, my lovely wife Mary, who's here, we spent a couple of really fun afternoons in the kitchen trying to figure out what the name of this magazine would be. As you've mentioned before, I didn't want anything that was obvious. I didn't want the title to have any connection with the eye or with lenses. I wanted something that felt friendly and something that had a certain intimacy and humor to it. The name I really want to call it YOU, Hefner. But I was talked out of it for legal reasons. I thought Mr. Raincoat would be a dandy name. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah.
Yeah. Question mark.
Yeah.
That would have been.
So
another thing I wanted to mention. The very funny thing about the first issue was it's actually in the window, and it was the logo with a photograph of a piece of wood. They're also over there on the wall. And of course, the first issue came out, it was distributed. I was so excited about, obviously, it being out in the world, that I would go to different newsstands and different magazine shops and make sure it was there. And I went to one place and I looked in photography and art. I saw Blind Spot, I saw Aperture, British Journal of Photography. No Dear Dave. So I went to the cashier and I said, do you have Dear Dave? And he thought and said, yes, and he pointed over there. They had put it in the section of magazines of woodworking, which I didn't realize that they existed, but there it was with, you know, modern woodworker. And so I thought maybe every, you know, for each issue we should do a different cover. One, a bridal cover, you know, a travel car. I digress.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
So speaking of the first issue, I'm just going to mention a few things that are in the issue. So you have a story by Lynn Tillman.
Right.
You have fashion photographs by Michael Ryan Kelly. You have manipulated images of Marco Breuer. And these funny and vulgar images by Maria Bradley.
Monica, yeah.
Monica, over here, which is...
The one that there's a folded chair and it says twat.
Yes. So it seems to me at the very first issue you're declaring kind of priority for the image, a kind of level playing field for all kinds of photography with selected and relatively short essays. You know, I guess that's just an observation, right? That you already kind of knew what it was, right? In that case, right? Because it already has Dear Dave sort of become something else since the beginning for you, or is it still kind of the same concept?
It's the same concept. I've been thinking, you know, whether or not there should be some. Probably at some point soon we will rearrange it, but I think that its interest in plurality and its interest in a diverse selection of photography, I think, will remain. Right. I guess another line of thought was to have, I mean, obviously text and writing about photography and photography coexists in a lot of magazines, but I also remember thinking that I wanted to publish portfolios and thus have the writing on an equal level. So the photographs weren't just the illustration of the writing, but the photographs were given a lot of prominence. Right. Yeah.
Well, in Blind Spot, it's the image that's sort of prioritized.
Yeah.
Oh, there's no text at all.
There's no text. Yeah.
Whereas in Aperture, I mean, you know, the text seemed to be prioritized over the image. I mean, there's lots of great images, but yeah. So I want to ask you about in Dear Dave #5, you feature the work of Tracy Barren.
Yes.
She was a student at SVA and she tragically died in 2008. And her pictures are sort of a working class, she sort of pictures a working class world that has its own sort of rough and elegant intimacy. I don't know, that's how I thought of it.
That's a very nice way of putting it.
I just wanted to ask you, could you say a little bit about her work and why it meant so much to you? Because I know it did. Yeah.
And why that work?
Why?
Tracy Barren, as Mark mentioned, was in one of the early issues, and unfortunately she's not alive. She was my student, and in fact, I don't think she ever graduated. Tracy's work was just beautiful and authentic and very honest. And I think there were photographs of herself and sometimes of her family, and I felt that they kind of abridged both fact and fiction. There were some pictures that were vaguely constructed and other pictures that were not. I actually, now that I think about it, I think that she was one of the earliest practitioners of that possibility of mixing different kinds of imagery. And her work had a lot of the work were self-portraits, and that fit in with a lot of work that was being done and is still being done. But I think the work was unique in its authenticity and its invention, and it's just its narrative complexity. I mean, does that answer the question?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, the work is not here, so yeah. But for all of you who don't know the work, her name is Tracy Barren, and she's represented by Leslie Tonkino Projects, and it's gorgeous work. Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't know if anyone's had a chance to look at the swimsuit issue of Dear Dave, which was, I don't remember what number it is, it was from 2011.
Yeah.
And it was my favorite issue, I think. So in 2011, Dear Dave had the swimsuit issue. And I think that Dear Dave issue is at least twice the size of the annual Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue. So from Henry Cartier-Bresson to Richard Mizrak, you collected, I don't know how many, maybe 100 photographs of people wearing bathing suits. And there are images by Matthew Barney, Penelope Umbrico, Bria Souders, Joel Sternfeld, Eric Fischel, Lee Friedlander, Harry Callahan, Alex Prager, Judith Joy Ross, Malcolm Leitner, Martin Parr, just to name a handful. And for me, like the swimsuit issue is sort of like represents the kind of editorial freedom that you've given yourself. It also displays what I think is your sort of sly curatorial approach. Because you take this anachronistic, this is very much your humor, right? You take this sort of anachronistic and sexist phenomenon of the swimsuit issue and in popular culture and transform it into that very limited idea into something that's expansive and smart and fun. And I think it's sort of risky in a way. I mean, it's funny, and I think most people understand it's playful, but it was sort of, kind of risky.
I don't see it as risky. I saw it as just kind of obvious that, of course we should use this. It's a well-known phenomenon, the swimsuit. I don't think I've actually seen it since I was a teenager, but I know that it exists because of the advertising.
It's still very good.
Yeah, you get. Is there a fold-out of some kind? But it just seemed like such an obvious idea. But one of the things that interests me is how, the subject matter of a group of pictures can remain ostensibly the same, and you can have a wide variety of interpretation. There's another example of that we did on a much more limited basis in the magazine. If you all look over there, there's a beautiful picture of a guy named Billy Sullivan who has the gray hair and the shadows. I just asked maybe 7 or 8 photographers to take a picture of Billy, who's a painter, and in just broadly different interpretations. And part of this is to emphasize something that's really obvious, which is that photography is so interpretive, that you can have a consistent subject, that the subject can remain the same, and you can have vastly different relationships to it.
Yeah.
So the swimsuit just seems so great.
But I just wanted to see that show, like it's some wonderful, large scale installation at some major museum or something. I don't think
why don't you propose it to a large scale major museum?
I could, but I don't think anyone will take it. But it's a great idea.
I'm hoping for a second swimsuit issue. I've been collecting, since that last issue, I've been collecting swimsuit pictures, and there's about 40 or 50. But if you look at bodies of work, invariably there might be 1 or 2 swimsuit. So if any of you are wondering, how can I get published in Dear Dave magazine, just make a swimsuit picture and send it on in.
So being the chair of the photography program at SVA, as well as the chair of it's the MFA in fashion photography.
Can we talk about you for a while?
No. The MFA in fashion photography, right? That's what it's called?
Yeah.
Which it's a program you started.
Yeah, it's actually MPS It's a Master of Professional Studies.
Okay. But this gives you kind of enormous influence in the New York photography world, which I don't think you wouldn't agree with.
I would very much like to think not.
All right, but I would say that you do. I mean, from not only all the students that you have in the environment that you create at the SVA, but also all the people that you hire, at the SVA who have had enormous influence, on obviously the students that go there. And again, I've never taught at SVA, but I know a lot of people who do, and just again, the sort of broad expanse of, experiences and approaches. So I would argue that you do. Anyway, so let's just move on from that.
We don't want to get in an argument.
No, let's not argue about that.
Maybe over dinner.
But I just want to ask you about how you're influenced by the sort of these generations of photographers, has sort of coming through your program, or you see in New York, and I know that you get out and you see a lot of stuff. So, just how does that change you in terms of what you think, not necessarily as a maker yourself, but just like how you think of photography and its possibilities?
Well, I should really say publicly and on camera, especially that it's such a privilege and a pleasure to be involved in this wonderful program. It's a vast program. As many of you know, there's 100 faculty members, and the school in and of itself is set up so it's a very entrepreneurial endeavor, which gives us chairs a tremendous amount of freedom. What was the question?
Well, just all of those generations of photographers that have been sort of coming through the SVA and that, that you interact with personally. I know that you review the graduating students' portfolios one by one, every single one of them.
And the third-year students.
Yes, so it's not like this hands-off approach.
Yeah.
I mean, you have a very direct relationship.
Ideally, what I wanted to do was to create, in addition to all the tasks and responsibilities that we have, the conventional responsibilities in terms of classes and curriculum, et cetera, I wanted to create a community. I wanted to create a community of ideas. I wanted to create a space that people could come in, students, faculty, visiting artists, and discuss and shape the future of photography. The fact that we are working with young people, they are the future. It's their medium, and they're going to determine what the future looks like. And we're there to help them with that conversation. So yeah, it's incredibly interesting and fulfilling. And I also think that it's become a lot less predictable in the last couple of years. And to watch the students form over the course of their years there, to form a relationship to photography, an idea of what photography is I couldn't feel that I was in a better place. At the same time, I would like to think, and I think this is the case, that there is no one school of working in this department. I would like to think that we encourage all different ways of working. So there's not necessarily one way or one solution or one answer to the question of what is photography. And I think it's, I also think that it's been, I haven't really thought of this that much, but I think it used to be reactive and now it's more proactive.
What?
Well, I remember, it wasn't too long ago that it seemed that many of the students were deeply influenced by, say, Nan Goldin's work. Just to pick a name out of the recent history. It was deeply influential. It gave the students tremendous permission. It rearranged what we think of as documentary. But again, it seemed like the students were reacting to that. Whereas now I feel like the students are much more creative and decisive and proactive in terms of what they're going to do.
Does
that make sense?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. Do you think that's some sort of rejection of some kind of master, aesthetic in some ways?
I think it's part of the plural community that's occurring. And I think even within the photographers that they are looking a lot at, like Roe Etheridge or like that other guy, Christian Patterson. Yeah. What they're seeing is a plurality of approach in terms of creating stories.
Yeah. I mean, it's very different from, not to be all, old school about it, but like when, I think we went to school we both went to school in the 70s and 80s and just
1950s.
Studying photography. I studied with Nick Nixon at Massachusetts College of Art, and so did Tina over here, and she can attest to this.
Yeah.
There was a very rigid approach. It's a small department, so I think that's partly responsible for that sort of approach, which is just very narrow and the social document and large format. But it's still, they've broadened a little bit, but it's still that kind of, mass art still has that kind of approach to photography. Obviously, SVA is a very different kind of environment and culture.
But it hasn't always been. When I started teaching there in the 1980s, the students were asked in their second year to declare whether they were commercial photographers or fine art photographers, and then they would have different curriculums. Obviously, that's a completely irrelevant question right now. But I think within academia, within art academia and photography departments, it still exists. I was at, I should not name it, but I was at a very prominent and good art school in the Midwest to do a review of the program. And, I noticed that all of the work was the sort of work that you hang on a wall, let's say. It was art photography. And I asked them, well, what about photography that as it exists in magazines or as it functions? And I think I said commercial photography, and someone said, "You mean like wedding photography?" So it's it's still photography.
Yeah.
I'm getting upset.
You are?
No, I'm not.
I want to see that. That's so rare.
I just get rattled when I think of that.
Yeah. So pretty early on in the history of Dear Dave, you started featuring a full page with the words, "What would Lynn Tillman do?" Even if you know Lynn Tillman's novel stories and art writing, it's a pretty enigmatic statement.
Not if, yeah. Okay.
So can you talk about how that started? Do you mind
Sure.
revealing how that started?
Well, it actually started. Mark and I were both raised Catholic, and we were. Should I go that far back in the?
You have to now, yeah.
Well, we all know about the phenomenon. What would Jesus do? And people wear bracelets that say "W." What would Jesus do? And then Mark and I, we were taught up at Bard, we shared a house together, and one afternoon we were talking about our deep relationship to Dean Martin as we were growing up. Probably not someone that's well known in this audience, and we thought we would put together something called "What Would Dean Martin Do?" Right. Dean Martin was a kind of drunk entertainer.
So how do we get from there to Lynn Tillman?
I don't know. Lynn Tillman is a close friend. Those in the literary community in Lower Manhattan are very familiar with her deep sense of engagement and counsel and wisdom and humor. And it just seemed to make a lot of sense to pose the question publicly, if we are facing some sort of decision, we need to ask ourselves, what would Lynn Tillman do? And then it became a bit of an advertising campaign. So it says, what would Lynn Tillman do? And then in much smaller print, it says, subscribe to Dear Dave magazine. And we did a wheat pasting campaign around Lower Manhattan.
A couple of years ago, and then that's become the title of her most recent book of collected essays with the same font, right?
They made a photograph of the poster on a building on the Lower East Side. Yeah. It was just nominated for a National Book Critics Award.
Yeah.
So
I think mostly because of the cover.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you do with Dear Dave? What would you like to do with Dear Dave that you haven't done yet?
I can answer that in a couple of ways. I think, Dear Dave has been pretty much under the radar. I think that's our style as much as anything. I think that we need to increase its presence. We need to have more subscribers. Very reasonable. I would like to include more writers. I would like to include more literary. I think that's the next objective. Francine Prose, who writes occasionally about photography but is mostly known for her essays in fiction, has just written something for the next issue. I would like to ask a lot of different literary characters to write about photography. It's always possible that we could do a book publishing entity at some point later. There's lots of possibilities. I also want to continue to, occasionally we'll do things like we publish some poems by a woman named Alice Rose George, who is not known for her poetry, but who's a very well-known curator and photography person. There's a drawing here by a guy named Jerry Vasuso, who's known as a photographer, but also makes drawings. So I would like to include even more information from the photography community, but things that are outside of what's normally seen. I hear Gregory Crutzen has a great recipe for chicken cacciatore that we're thinking about. So, you get the idea.
I just, behind you is this image of the Among the Thugs by Bill Bruford. Can you talk about that image? Because I don't remember that from the magazine, but that book was actually made quite an impression on me.
I can't talk about that image. I know nothing about it.
Really?
Well, I know it's by Mark Joseph Berg, and he published a beautiful book that was about bookstores. And in all the different aspects, and the idea of the bookstore as being a phenomenon which is not so much a part of our culture. So that was excerpted from it. I think it's a terrific cover. I think it's an iconic image. So, should we ask for questions from the audience?
Yeah, I think we should. Yeah, does anyone? Yes.
Well, as I mentioned before, Dear Dave, the idea was to create a title of some intimacy and to set up, I write an editor's letter that says Dear Dave, and to suggest that the magazine is for individuals. The magazine was named after my father, Dave, and those letters were written to him over the years. I remove a lot of, incidental information, but yeah. Does that answer your question? You wanted me to go public with that. Oh, lots and lots and lots of letters, yeah. If there's anyone named Dave in the audience and they'd like to donate some, because...
Dear Dave,
yeah.
Emails.
Yeah, who knows if you have any friends named Dave, send them on. A friend of mine, David Levi Strauss, wrote a letter when he was young to Adlai Stevenson. And he got a letter back from Adlai Stevenson saying, Dear Dave, so that's in the files, yeah. I mean, I think that, I think that there is less fashion and less photojournalism in the show than in the magazine, for example, but I think that that's just the way that this worked in terms of getting framed pictures from people. I mean, I'd like to think that the work that you see here has certain qualities of intelligence and humor and open-mindedness and redefining what the photographic medium is, but doing it in such a way that it's a sort of spirit of inquiry and mirth.
Well, I think Stephen's right in the sense that there's, in some ways more diversity in the magazine than there is on the walls here, because there's less fashion, that's in documentary, as you pointed out. But I would, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint, it's hard to define what a kind of broad sensibility looks like, right? Because it sort of defies that description. But I think one thing that the pictures do have in common is a sense of playfulness, but a seriousness in that he does. I mean, one of the things I admire about Stephen is that he does take all sort of genres of photography seriously, and I really respect that and feel like that's inclusive, and as opposed to exclusive, or as opposed to kind of like fixed position that leaves out a lot of people, because I think many of us have encountered, texts or institutions that were very exclusive around certain kinds of positions. And as viable as those positions may be, they seem to me as like, oh, okay, that's pretty provincial in its own way. It may be interesting, but so I think that, the small Catholicism has to do with just this broad embrace. And but other than that, I couldn't identify a sensibility, I mean, I think Stephen does, because in the end, chooses all the images. And I've written a number of essays, and I say, here are the pictures that could go along, and I'm always surprised myself which ones he chooses.
Well, I mean, one can't discount taste. I mean, as an individual, I guess it's also a reflection of my taste. Hopefully, as Mark says, it does have a fairly broad position. I also think that, I mean, two things. As the editor, I get to discover things, which is such a great pleasure. The act of discovering work which has not been seen. And I also think that we in the States are perhaps more provincial than we think we are. There's so much work here that hasn't really been seen, but there is so much work around the world that is deserving of an audience here. But again, the possibility of putting work of someone who's in their early 20s, who's just graduated from a undergraduate program or an MFA program, next to somebody who's been working for 60 or 70 years is really quite thrilling. I mean, in the issue that we just published a couple of days ago, on the cover is a woman named Ellen Carey, who's been working consistently for 30 or 40 years, and I think has really contributed a very unique relationship to abstraction, and it's a very painterly abstraction. But as the years go on, she's not as well known as she was, I think. And that's another thing. I'm able to straddle different generations because of my own age and my own placement, but I spend the day with 20-year-olds. So we also have a group of pictures of photographs of Robert Rauschenberg. Now, obviously, Rauschenberg does not need an introduction, but he did a wonderful series in the 80s, which he called photoms. And it's a vertical stack of images that he took that have a direct relationship to his collage sensibility. So I don't think, for example, that work is as known as it should be. So, yeah. Yeah. You've stumped me. I know that I am much more, in addition to what I see at SVA, day in and day out, I feel much more responsible to looking at the much vaster landscape of contemporary photography. So I'm much more cognizant of or trying to understand what's going on around the world, and looking at a lot of things online and going to art fairs. So I feel it's my responsibility now, not just my pleasure, but my responsibility to see new things. I mean, my job as an editor is really a curatorial position. And I find the process, I don't think this really answers your question, but I find the process of looking at a large body of work and choosing 10 or 12 images to be really an engaging and interesting process, which I like a lot. So perhaps a kind of editing. I would like well, they are international. I think in each issue there are people whose work who do not show necessarily in New York City. I would like a more thorough distribution internationally. So, yeah. There's a terrific magazine, by the way, called GUP. I don't know if you guys know it. It stands for Great Unique Photographs, or Maria, what is it? It's great, and it covers what's going on in Europe in a very innovative and unique way. So, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions?
Anything else, Mark?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Thank you all so much
for coming.
for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah.